Namaste, everybody. Nice to have you back. And we hope you will continue to enjoy this series on the Bhagavad Gita. Remember, we were on chapter 2, and we last ended at chapter 2, verse 60. So we're going to carry on today from verse 61, which Jiniji will now sing for us.
60, verse 60, yeah.
Yeah.
Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. Now Bhagavan says yatataha api kaunteya. Yatataha means by practicing. Purushasya vipaschitaha, the person who is endowed with his high intellect, still Bhagavan says indriyani pramathini. Indriyani means senses. Pramathini means they are very strong and agitated. It says haranti prasabham manah. Those senses are so strong and agitated. Bhagavan says prasabham manah haranti. The mind which is so difficult, those senses even take away that mind, even the person who is so endowed in intellect. So this is what the meaning of this.
So translated, it says the senses are so strong and agitated, O son of Kunti, that they can distract the mind even of a person endowed with a high and steady intellect. So let's start examining why Bhagavan is saying this, that somebody even with an intellect that actually is steady can get very agitated very quickly. How do our senses work and what do they do? Basically, they link the external world to our brain. So they carry information about the physical world around us, physical stimuli, into our brain, and the brain in turn then processes and interprets this, enables us to react to our surroundings. Now, in the old days, you were a hunter-gatherer, so your senses see a lion, and you know a lion is dangerous. The eyes send the information to the brain. The brain now says, danger. And so our ancestors knew, I better either get ready to defend myself or I better flee. Typically, we have 5 senses: vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. We have different types of sensory receptors for each. So we have neurons in our retina, other neurons in our nose that enable us to smell. Now, the response of these neurons is proportional to the stimulus that they're getting. So, for example, a very bright light, those of us who've had, if you've ever had a retina test, you'll know that it's a very strong response from our retina. When the retina specialist shines a really bright light into our eye and looks all around the retina to check that it's properly attached, everything is okay. Our retina is stimulated far more by that bright light than just a dim light. So a very strong stimulus can affect the brain. So for example, many people say after such a retinal exam, I had a headache. Right? That's because the stimulus was very strong. Our sensory systems are also there to detect change. If a stimulus is long-lasting, like a light which stays on, we begin to perceive it less and less because our sensory systems adapt. If we look at the center of a certain picture, which I'll give you, it's called, if you just Google circling lilac dot illusion, you will see when it comes up that there are circling lilac dots going round and round and round and round and round. But if you stare at it for a while at the center of the frame, the lilac dots fade and it leaves a single green dot circling a gray background. This is because our visual system is adapting and the stationary image fades. We only perceive the part that changes. So we realize there never were any circling lilac dots. There's just one dot. So if we're stable ourselves, our brain adapts to the stimulus. So even a person who practices discrimination, is self-control, practices meditation too, is affected by their senses. They also are going to see the lilac dots. But as they calmly stay with it, the lilac dots fade. The brain, what does it do? It adapts. It realizes. And these lilac circling dots, by the way, are available very easily by Googling. You can also Google lilac chaser illusion. You can Google that too. Sri Krishna here is responding to the thought we may have that if we have controlled our actions, so we're not eating the rasgulla or the jalebi or the chocolate bar, what difference does it make if we are thinking of one? So his objection, what he's saying is, in a moment of weakness or inattention, what we are hankering after, it doesn't matter how strong we are, we will give in to it at some point or another because our senses are so powerful. So let's move to verse 61.
Tani sarvani sayyamya yukta asita matparaha vashehi yasyendriyani tasya pragya pratisthita. So now Bhagavan is answering again, as Arjuna has asked before, that who is sthita pragya, whose intellect is steady. Now Bhagavan says, Tani sarvani sanyamya. Tani means all those senses, who has overcome to all those senses. Sanyamya is overcoming. Yukta asita matparaha. Yukta is the yogi who is practicing. Asita matparaha. Asita is concentrated. Matparaha, Bhagavan says, within me. And then he says, Vasehi yasya indriyani. Yasya means the person whose senses are in their control. Bhagavan says, Tasya pragya pratisthita. Their intellect is so steady. So this is what Bhagavan says in this.
So Sri Krishna now says, the disciplined individual, so let's look at his definition. What is a disciplined individual? He says, that individual is established in perfect knowledge, wisdom, is one who subdues or restrains their senses and keeps their mind ever absorbed only in me. Now this actually links with verse 59. Before we reach that stage where even the desire for the objects of the senses is gone, we start by restraining the senses. In other words, we're not going to get rid of our desires immediately. First, we try controlling the senses. In other words, Bhagavan's actually asking us to take this one step at a time. He's not asking us to retire to the Himalayas, enter a cave and start meditating in an aquarium in 2 days. It's not going to happen. So this is very sound advice, because before we study calculus, we all study arithmetic, and we understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that 2 divided by 2 equals 1. We can't do it in the reverse order. Nobody studies calculus first, then goes backwards and realizes 2 plus 2 equals 1. So Bhagavan also, in this quest, is saying, take it steadily, one stage by another stage. When we're able to keep the senses in check and focus our attention only on him, he says we will acquire the perfect knowledge. But we will acquire it. It is not that we will get it in some flash of insight. Now we need to understand also, what does Sri Krishna mean when he says me? He means two quite different things depending on our level of development. Now the first is the obvious meaning. He means me as Sri Krishna. We can focus on him in that form because it's very easy for us to imagine that form. It's been described to us multiple times in multiple sources, the Bhagavatam, the Mahabharata. So we can focus our minds on that form of his. That's one option. But we should remember that Sri Krishna is also the Paramatma, or the universal consciousness which exists everywhere. And we'll come more and more to that in later chapters. So me also refers to that universal consciousness which is formless and which we also refer to as the Paramatma or Brahman. We can do either. Science is only just beginning to explore concepts like consciousness, and we have no explanation for how it arises. We only know that we, along with other creatures, are conscious. There's a researcher, a mathematician and theoretical physicist, Johannes Kleiner, at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy in Germany, and I'll quote him. He says, "Consciousness, or better, conscious experience, is obviously a part of reality. We are all having it. But without understanding how it relates to the known physics, our understanding of the universe is incomplete." Kleiner works with a colleague, Sean Tull, who's a mathematician at the University of Oxford in the UK, and he's hoping that their work will enable them to precisely define consciousness, or come to a conclusion what is consciousness, and postulate a view called panpsychism. And this is what panpsychism is. He says this theory claims consciousness is inherent in even the tiniest pieces of matter, an idea that suggests the fundamental building blocks of reality have conscious experience. A very startling and novel thought for Western science, but not novel to a reader of the Gita. Crucially, it implies consciousness could be found throughout the universe. And you can Google, "Is the universe conscious?" and this will come up. We call this universal consciousness Paramatma or Brahman. Obviously, this is a very complex matter, and by the way, we are going to examine it in much more detail in later chapters, especially 8 and 9. But right now, this is just an introduction to the fact that, look, something called consciousness exists, which science cannot explain. They call it the hard problem of consciousness. But science is beginning to explore it, but which Bhagavan talks about extensively throughout the Gita. So it's much easier for us to focus our mind on this Paramatma as Sri Krishna, because it's very difficult to focus on that which is formless and essentially nameless, without qualities, Nirguna Brahman. It's very difficult to focus our minds, which are tied to our senses, on that. And hence, he says, you can concentrate on me as Sri Krishna. Verse 62.
So now, verse 62. Dhyayato vishayan pumsaha sangasteshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kamaha kamat krodho bhijayate. So in previous verse, as Bhagavan mentioned about that the senses are controlled, whose senses are controlled, but whose senses are not controlled. Now he is answering about that. He says that dhyayataha vishayan punsah. Dhyayataha means what? Continuously thinking of any objects. What happens? One says, sangah teshu upajayate. From there, the desires or attachment starts. Sangat sanjayate kamaha. From that attachment, Bhagavan says, kamaha jayate. That means the desire to get it. Bhagavan says, if that is not fulfilled, then kamat krodho bhijayate. Then Bhagavan says, from that desire, krodha means anger, anger happens. So anger takes birth from those desires are not fulfilled. So now this is, next to us is this beautiful cycle where Bhagavan says that how the things get worse and worse by just thinking of some material objects, and once those are not fulfilled.
So now come two of the most important verses in chapter 2, the really penetrating insight by Bhagavan into what happens when we focus on sense objects. And as we go through it, I'll take you through it, we will see that science supports every step of his analysis. And the analysis is what happens when we focus on sense objects, why does it lead to anger, and then what does that anger do to us? This verse 62 says, when one focuses one's attention on objects, one develops attachment to them. Attachment leads to desire, and from desire is born anger. So he's explaining why he does not want us to focus constantly on sense objects. And it's a truly penetrating insight into what happens to us when the main focus of our life is just on objects. And he's giving us a lesson on how the human mind works and its psychology. Shri Krishna is now explaining to Arjuna why constantly dwelling on objects is not a good way for us to progress spiritually. It's also, by the way, not a good way to live from a point of view of mental and physical health. Now, when one focuses one's attention on objects, he says, is his first phrase, he's referring here to our aim and focus being on objects. And the object could be a car, it could be a house, it could be clothes, it could be a latest iPhone, a piece of jewelry. It doesn't matter what the object is. The problem is on constantly focusing on it. What we are focused on so much, we will think constantly of these objects. That's what we'll think about the whole time. How do I get the new iPhone? How can I collect enough money? I wonder, can I borrow money from, mom and dad? Can I borrow my friends? You're constantly going to be focused on it. He then explains now what happens. So now we're focused on the object. Now what happens? He says one develops attachment to them. So when we constantly, and it's very logical, when we constantly think of an object, we're attracted to it. We develop an attachment and a very strong desire for it. So we hear of a new iPhone. We see images of the new iPhone. We hear that the iPhone is, it's nearly sold out. Better get here quick. We keep thinking of the iPhone. How can we get hold of one? So we've already developed an attachment to it before it's ever come into our possession. And what does that lead to now, he says? That attachment now leads to desire, he says. Again, that's very logical. You've thought about the iPhone, you've focused on it, you've now developed an attachment to it. No, I really like its features. Now what happens? Now you have a desire for it. Now we like the object very much. So we begin to really want it or desire it, as he puts it. We want to own it and make sure it's ours. We're no longer happy just thinking about it. We want to actually own it. And then what does he say? He says, from desire is born anger. Now the new iPhone, we get it and stolen from us. A thief snatches it from our hand and runs away. Not an infrequent occurrence. Now it's natural for us to feel surprised, maybe aggrieved, maybe even frustrated that, now I've got to waste time and energy. I've got to change my number maybe, make sure the thief can't run up any charges that I'll be responsible for. These are all natural feelings. But what people feel in this situation is anger or worse, rage. Now, Jean-William Fritz Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who is well known for his work on child development. This work is very interesting to this particular verse, and we'll see why in a minute. As far back as 1932, there was a book called The Moral Judgment of the Child. He records his observation, and even babies express jealousy over objects, giving signs of violent rage when a toy is taken away from them and given to another. Hence, Bhagavan advises that attachment to objects leads to anger. It does so even in babies. When psychologist Batya Licht and her colleagues in 2008, so we're now moving forward like 3/4 of a century, they filmed 22-month-olds playing with their peers in daycare. Nearly a quarter of all sources of conflict were over possessions, where the child either defended his or her objects from another child or wanted to take an object from another child. So see what objects do to us. There's a research paper entitled, and you can look it up again, Conflict Between Peers in Infancy and Toddler Age. What do they fight about? Look it up, and let me again read directly from the paper, so I'm not trying to paraphrase it. Although there is some evidence for the development of understanding of ownership from 18 to 24 months, no such evidence exists for the first year of life. So in other words, in the first year of life, there is no concept of ownership or possession. Other motivations such as hunger, thirst, and the urge to explore do not require a sense of self-awareness. Indeed, these basic motivations are observable even in animals. Curiosity or the desire to explore is of particular importance when investigating infants' and toddlers' behavior towards toys and other children, especially because the urge to explore objects, primarily with the hands, peaks during the second year of life. In other words, when you see your little baby of 9 months or a year, you take something away from them, expressing anger, frustration. It's not because they think that the object is theirs. It's not to do with possession. It's because you are stopping them exploring. And they explore with their hands. That's why babies, what do they do often? You pick up a baby, it smacks your face. It's trying to explore. It doesn't know how to do it. It doesn't know to gently run its hands or his hands on your face. Yeah, all babies do it. They go smack, yeah. All they're trying to do is explore. Similarly, when they're knocking a doll about, it's not because they're trying to break the doll. They're trying to explore what's the texture of the doll. What does this doll do? What does this toy do? So when you take that away from them, they're expressing their frustration at the fact that you are not now allowing them to explore it. It's nothing as yet to do with possession. So in other words, even before 18 months of age, attachments to objects do make us angry, but the reasons are different. They arise because we perceive ourselves as being thwarted from our natural desire to explore, touch, feel, satisfy our curiosity. What is this object? But even at such a young age, attachments to object, even if it's just a desire to explore them, what do? They make us angry. But now things change. At around 18 to 24 months, as the child grows, we develop the concept of ownership. Now, researchers observe that around this time, about 22 months is the average, the concept and expression of mine arises. Emotions, anger, and insult are now intense. Now there's a bond between the object and the child. So now it's not just a question of exploring. The child has developed the concept that, no, this is something that belongs to me. It's an extension of myself, in other words. There's also a need to show dominance through the object. I have it, you don't. Right? The research, therefore, again confirms in full Bhagavan's statement, from desire is born anger. Christian Jarrett is another researcher, a very well-known one, who holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, master's degree in neuroscience, both funded by scholarships from the UK's Medical Research Council. He has a first-class honours degree in psychology, is an associate of the British Psychological Society. He gave a TED Talk, and you can look up the TED Talk too. It's called, "Why Are We So Attached to Our Things?" And he notes there's a well-established phenomenon in psychology known as the endowment effect, where we value items much more highly just as soon as we own them. The item becomes an extension of ourselves. He continued the research, which started with babies, and mentioned using adults now. And the results are actually quite fascinating. In one famous demonstration, students were given a choice between a coffee mug or a Swiss chocolate bar as a reward for helping out with the research. And half chose the mug, about half chose the chocolate. That's fine. They seem to value the two rewards more or less equally and similarly. Other students were given a mug first and then a surprise chance to swap it for a chocolate bar. Guess what? Only 11% wanted to. Why? Because they already associated the mug as theirs. Yet another group started out with chocolate, and most preferred to keep it and not swap it. So whatever they were given became theirs, and the instant it became theirs, there was possessiveness, and they had no desire now to swap it. In other words, the students nearly always put greater value on whichever reward they started out with. Part of this shows how quickly we form connections between our senses, our sense of self, and the things we consider ours. And you can listen to the TED Talk. Just look up Christian Jarrett, Why Are We So Attached to Our Things? You can also read that TED Talk. So basically what it's saying, our anger is stemming from the fact that we identify our objects with ourselves, our sense of self. And it affects our sense of worth. The attachment can be seen at the neural level. Even more interesting research. So what happened, neuroscientists actually scanned the participants' brain while they allocated various objects, either to a basket labeled mine or another basket labeled somebody else's, Alex's. When participants subsequently looked at their new things, their brain showed more activity in a region that usually flickers into life whenever we think of ourselves. So thinking about the objects that were put in their basket, so think about this carefully. There were objects in a basket that was labeled mine. The part of the brain that flickered into life looking at them was the part of the brain that flickers into life when we think about ourselves. So what are we doing? We're associating the objects as an extension of ourselves. They've become ourselves. In other words, they identified the objects as part of themselves. And the paper is called Extended Self, Medial Prefrontal Activity During Transient Association of Self and Objects. And note the word transient. Very interesting. So Bhagavan is saying the same, objects are temporary. So the paper itself is called During Transient Association of Self and Objects. Association will end at some point or another. You know, your favorite fluffy toy will break down. Your car will break down. And yet we form such attachments to them. And all of the above research shows why our brain attaches to objects. We view them, we identify with them as an extension of ourselves. Our attachment to objects now eventually leads to anger. You know, when a car breaks down, you can literally see people on the street kicking it, right? Why aren't you working? It's a little weird, yeah. The extent of our attachment is shown by yet another experiment. So let's look at that one. All of which you can see are completely validating Bhagavan's words of warning. So there's another paper, which you can look up again, entitled The Psychology of Stuff and Things. It was published in The Psychologist, publication of the British Psychological Society, August 2013, volume 26. Same person, Christian Jarrett, he writes, most children have an unusually intense relationship with a specific attachment object, usually a favorite blanket or a soft toy. There was an intriguing study by Bruce Hood and Paul Bloom. The majority of 3 to 6-year-old children preferred to take home their original attachment object as opposed to a duplicate made by a copying machine. To the prospect of taking a copy, the most common response was horror. I'll give you a copy of that piece of paper or that painting or that drawing or that blanket. The response was horror. Says Natalia Gershow, who helped with the studies. A very few sweet and obedient children, she said okay, but then promptly burst into tears. 4 of the children even refused for their attachment toy or object to be copied. They refused to allow it to be copied in the first place. That's despite the fact that they were happy enough to take a copy of an experimenter's toy. Sometimes if you offer them a copy of somebody else's toy, they say, oh yeah, I'll have that. Not their own toy. So it's as if the children believed their special object had a unique essence, a form of magical thinking that reappears in adulthood. How? In a treatment of heirlooms, celebrity memorabilia, and artwork. So we have a special attachment to heirlooms. This belonged to my mother, this belonged to my grandmother, this belonged to my aunt. We have a special attachment to that. So we can now see why such a deep attachment indeed turns into anger. Bhagavan also interestingly uses the phrase, from attachment is born anger. And it's a very important point Jiniji made. These words are important because we know that that which is born must die. In other words, Bhagavan is telling us we can make our anger die. So we spent a lot of time on this verse because it's a critical verse and it's a theme to which Bhagavan will return again and again in different ways throughout the Gita. Thank you for staying with me through the verse. It's a very important one.
Right.
So verse 63.
63. Beautiful explanation. Krodhat bhavati sammohah sammohat smriti vibhramah smriti bhramshat buddhinasho buddhinashat pranashyati. So now Bhagavan says, Krodhat bhavati sammohah. In the previous verse he ended with anger. Now he says, anger leads to sammohah. Sammohah is delusion. From delusion, sammohat smriti vibhramaha. From delusion, smriti vibhramaha means memory loss. Then they slowly start losing memory. Then it says smriti bhramshat buddhinaso. By losing memory, from there they go to buddhinasha. Then they destroy their own intellect. And then buddhinashat pranashyati. By destroying or by getting distracted that intellect, they destroy their own selves. So destroying their own selves means it's not that physically they destroy themselves, it is intellectually they destroy them. So their identity, they lose everything. So this is beautiful again, the cycle that how that continuously focusing on one object can lead us towards destruction. So from there to end is destruction.
He now says anger, and this is another beautiful analytical verse, which again we'll see is completely backed up, and I'll show you how. Anger, he says, leads to delusion or clouding of judgment, which results in bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, the intellect gets destroyed. And when the intellect is destroyed, one is ruined. And let's follow Bhagavan step by step. Let's follow his analysis step by step. Anger, he says, leads to delusion and clouding of judgment. And I think we all know that intuitively. We don't make the best decisions when we're angry. Now, we saw in verse 2 that psychiatry, delusion is defined as what? A belief that is clearly false. So we're believing something that's not true, it's false. That indicates an abnormality in the affected person's content of thought. The false belief is not accounted for by the person's cultural or religious background. So you can't explain away that false belief by saying that it's something in their cultural or religious background and their upbringing, nor by his or her level of intelligence. In other words, it negatively affects people's judgment and their decisions. Now let's go back to the research paper we started to look at in verse 56. Fuel in the fire, it was called. How anger impacts judgment and decision making. In this, the authors give a summary of the effects of anger. So let me just recap on that. First, remember, there is the desire to hurt those who hurt them. Drives the rejection of unfair offers in the ultimatum game, if you remember that. We discussed this in chapter 1, verse 20, the ultimatum game. Then relative to measured dispositional fear, dispositional anger is associated with risky choices. So when we're angry, we make risky choices, is what it's saying in brief. And optimistic perceptions of risk. In other words, we underestimate the risk to ourselves in making a decision. This was a study published by Lerner and Keltner in 2001. So basically, we believe false things. Then, third conclusion, anger activated more punitive attributions, i.e. amount of blame, harsher punishment, and heuristic processing. A study by Lerner, 1998. I.e. we start to take decisions based on a more limited subset of the available information. We don't take all the information into account. We look at a subset of information. Why? Because basically our judgment is clouded. we start to lose our balance. Our judgment can be flawed because we don't take all factors into account. Fourth effect, anger predicted optimistic perceptions of risks. Remember, we said already that we underestimate the risks. We're angry and we think, no, I'll be able to get away with this. So we underestimate the risk to ourselves. Related to terrorism within the year following, 9/11. Yeah? So in other words, what they're saying is, after the year following 9/11, there was anger. That anger made optimistic perceptions of risks. So basically what? Judgment is flawed. Then he says delusion leads to loss of memory. Let's look at that. Now when we suffer delusions, what does it mean? We hold false beliefs. We have an abnormal thinking pattern. And Bhagavan then says we have confused memory. Is he right again? In a paper published 2nd of July 2013, it was called Deficits in Executive and Memory Processes in Delusional Disorder, a case control study. Researchers concluded the following. When compared to controls, cases of delusional disorder showed a significantly poorer performance in most cognitive tests. Thus, it says we demonstrate deficits in flexibility, impulsivity, and updating components of executive functions, as well as in memory processes. These findings held significant even after taking into account sex, age, educational level, and premorbid IQ. So what is that saying? Basically, in a nutshell, it affects all our cognitive skills, including memory. Delusion does. Now again, you can look up those papers. Then Bhagavan says, he uses the phrase, when memory is lost, he says intelligence is lost. Yet another paper. Working memory and intelligence are highly related constructs, but why? Researchers note, therefore, short-term memory, working memory, and mental speed are significantly related to intelligence. Memories often form the basis of our decision making. Yeah, we remember something bad that happened when we took such and such a decision. We say, oh, excuse me, I mustn't take that decision again. If our memories are lost, then our ability to think, our intelligence is significantly impacted. We rely on our memories for what? To learn from our mistakes, to not make the same mistake again. Well, if our memories are lost, we don't have that support structure on which to base our decisions. Then he says, when the ability to discriminate intelligence is destroyed, one is ruined. Well, if we've lost our intelligence, what's the purpose of our life here? What can we learn or achieve? Basically, very little. Hence, Bhagavan says one is ruined in the context that the entire purpose of our journey to this planet is lost. We have no further capacity to learn. So, that's science's analysis also of exactly what Bhagavan says and supports it at every step.
Verse 64. Ragadvesha viyuktaistu vishayanindriyaischaran atmavasyairi vidheyatma prasadamadigatchati. Bhagavan says ragadvesha viyuktaihi. Vyuktaha means who is the free from raga and dvesha. Raga is attachment. Dvesha is the great or strong dislikes. One says who is free from this both, and Vishayan Indriyahi Charan. Vishayan means in objects by senses. Even they enjoy any objects by senses, but they are free from attachment and dislikes. Atmavasyahi, who has controlled or overcome their senses. Vidheyatma, the person. Prasadam adigachati. The word prasadam means the great happiness or the ultimate happiness. One says that kind of person reaches to ultimate happiness.
So Bhagavan now says he's now giving the contrast between the person who's constantly focused on sense objects and has an uncontrolled brain, a brain prone to delusion, anger, loss of judgment. He's now giving us the reverse. He's saying, but one who controls the mind and is free from attachment and strong dislikes, even while experiencing or enjoying the objects of the senses, attains the ultimate happiness. This verse is effectively Bhagavan summarizing what he has said, but the reverse. Now he says one who controls has overcome the mind. Remember in verse 49, we saw the difference between a composed mind and one not so composed. The difference is so great. Do you remember there's a difference in the MRI scan image? You can literally see the difference on the scan between a composed and a not composed mind. Now, before we can get to the stage of the completely composed mind, we have to control and then later overcome the mind. And Sri Krishna will talk about this in far more detail in later chapters, including chapter 6. He then says that such a person who controls the mind is free from attachment and strong dislikes. This now ties in with verse 56, where he says that the person has discarded all desires for sense objects. Having discarded all desires for sense objects, the person's also free from attachments. That means to objects and the results of actions. And they're also free from aversion. So they're free from both opposites. Aversion to what? Aversion to objects or the results of actions. Now, this is a very interesting statement because he compares the one who is free from attachment but is also free from aversion. And he's asking us to be free of both. We saw earlier it's impossible to predict the outcome of any action. You remember we said that by the time we're 9 years old, there are 12,442 different variable factors that come into our life. And therefore it's quite impossible to predict the outcome of anything we do. It's also impossible, do you remember we said, to predict whether the outcome is good or bad. And we gave the example of a person, do you remember, who missed a train? And then it later turned out that there was a major accident on the train. So Bhagavan says, he who is in control of his mind has no objects or results he considers good or bad. And therefore he's also free of attachments, meaning likes, and aversions, dislikes. But let's also note that references to attachments and aversions all relate to material objects. Bhagavan is not saying we should not have an attachment to the Paramatma, meaning himself. Nor is he saying we should not have an aversion, for example, to seeing people or other creatures suffer. We should have such an aversion. Then he says, even while experiencing the objects of the senses. So he's not saying that such a person will not use material objects. We all have to. We're on this planet. We have a body. We have to clothe it. We have to feed it. There's no one who is not going to use material objects because we have to for food, water, shelter. These are requirements for our life, probably on any planet, although I'm not aware of life on other planets, but I would guess so. He's merely saying we should not develop an attachment to such objects. Why? Because they're temporary. And they have no basis in reality. You remember I quoted earlier from a science paper, it uses, instead of the word temporary, it says transient. All these enjoyments are transient. They come, they go. Such a person, he says, achieves ultimate happiness. Now let's examine that in a little bit of detail. And there's a story told in our scriptures to explain what is meant by ultimate happiness, and it's about a dog who continuously chews a bone. And Jiniji is going to take over and tell that story.
Yeah.
You remember the dog
Yeah.
who chews, yeah.
So there is one saying in the Tarka Sangra. It says that Asthi Kukkuranyaya. Asthi means the bone and Kukkura is dog. So it says that the way dog is keep chewing the bone, now dog doesn't know why he's chewing. But so it says that while the dog is chewing that bone from the back tooth, he starts getting that some blood and that call, I think, sweet pain, what they call the pain, something like that. So he gets that sweet pain, which he enjoys that pain also. And by chewing that bone, he gets blood out of that. And he tastes that blood, he feels that I'm getting this taste from the bone. So the same way, we think that we are enjoying desires, but the desire is giving us pain. So that is what the story about Asti Kukurnyaya.
In other words, the dog thinks that the pleasure is coming from the bone, which of course it's not. So he's saying we are similar. Pleasures from the objects of the senses, they're the same. We think the pleasure is coming from the object, so we go on pursuing it more and more and more, damaging ourselves more and more. Bhagavan then uses the word prasada, meaning ultimate happiness, because the happiness from the result of following his advice is quite different. It has no damaging effects, and it leads to ultimate and real happiness, from which the person cannot be moved no matter what happens. Such a person following Bhagavan's advice is rewarded with what? A composed mind, under all circumstances. So we'll go to 65.
Yeah. Prasade sarva dukkhanam hanirasyopajayate prasanna chetaso hyasuhu buddhihi pariyavatishthate. Bhagavan says prasade sarva dukkham. Prasadam, as we explained before, prasadam is the ultimate happiness. He says in ultimate happiness, sarva dukkhanam hani, that all sorrows or all the pains, hani he means get destroyed. And then Bhagavan says prasanna chetasaha hyashu. Prasanna chetasaha means whose mind or intellect is happy. Hyasu buddhi paryavat. Ashu means immediately. Bhagavan is very, some places, like in very few verses, Bhagavan is using immediate result. He doesn't say any immediate result anywhere. But in very few verses, in one or two verses, he says that immediate results. So Ashu means immediately. Prasanna chetasan, a person who is very happy, they immediately buddhi paryavasti state. They stays in that great intellect.
So he now says, to the composed intellect comes the ultimate happiness, in which all sorrows end. And that intellect immediately becomes firmly established on all sides, in the Atma, he means. So once a person has achieved all of the above, their mind is calm. Now the mind is peaceful, tranquil, and established in their own self. But let's summarize the qualities of such a person so we can recognize them. You remember it was Arjun's question, how do I recognize such a person? So let's summarize it so we can recognize such a person. Verse 15, he says, who is not affected by happiness and distress and remains steady in both. Verse 41, he says, the intellect of those who are on this path is resolute, determined, focused. Nothing shifts them away from the path. There is no occurrence which is going to make them shift or divert. Verse 48, they are steadfast in the performance of their duty. They will continue to do their duty. Verse 51, they have equanimity of intellect. They stop seeking the results of actions. Verse 52, they cross the quicksand of illusion and are indifferent to what has been heard and what is yet to be heard, about sense enjoyments, in other words. They're indifferent to that aspect. Verse 53, he says, they ceased to be assailed by doubt, remain steadfast in the knowledge of the self. Verse 55, the person has discarded all desires for sense objects, is satisfied in the self, and has a steady intellect. Verse 56, the mind remains undisturbed amidst misery, and we should say apparent misery. This links with verse 15, they do not crave for pleasure from material objects, and they are free from attachment, fear, and anger. Then verse 57, they remain unattached, without affection in all circumstances. They're neither delighted by good fortune, they're not dejected by tribulation. That's the summary of what Bhagavan has given us are the qualities of that equanimous mind. And shall we stop here?
Yeah.
I think because we can now continue next week.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you've probably heard enough and have more than enough to digest by now. So we want to thank you for your time, which we appreciate. Thank you for listening again. And we will see you again in the next episode, where we'll start from verse 66. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.